Hi, and welcome to You Can Too. I'm Dave Stradell, Program Coordinator for Marketing, Management, and Entrepreneurial Studies at Muskegon Community College. You Can Too is a program and a philosophy that encourages people in all fields of interest and of all ages to consider starting or owning a business as a career path, or the next stage of their career. In this special two-episode format, we are pleased to bring you the March 2014 lecture presentation by Dr. Eileen Sung Had on the rise of entrepreneurship. Dr. Sung Had is the Associate Director of Academic Programs in the University of Michigan's College of Engineering Center for Entrepreneurship. In a separate episode, we'll present a pre-event panel discussion by area entrepreneurs and people who work closely with area business owners. Panelists include Mike Suman, inventor, author, NPR broadcast host and consultant; Eric Seifert, business co-owner, finance and strategy specialist at GVSU Small Business Development Center; and Joe Finkler, business owner and president of Grand Rapids and Muskegon Inventor Networks. I invite you to watch as the panel and Dr. Sung Had explore the rise of entrepreneurship.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to come out and see what you guys have going on in terms of entrepreneurship on the west side of the state. We hear a lot about all of the great things going on between everything here, Grand Rapids, as well as Lansing. So it's really a pleasure to be able to be a part of that, and I really appreciate the invitation, so thank you very much. Today, what I thought I'd do is talk to you a little bit about entrepreneurship and education, and what we're doing at University of Michigan. And also sort of explain how someone like me with the background that he described actually landed in this. It's been a really exciting ride. I've been at the university for about 7 years, and I have really enjoyed every minute of it. So the agenda that we'll follow today is pretty easy. The first thing is I usually like to know who I'm speaking with, so we'll talk a little bit about who you are. I'll talk to you about why entrepreneurship is important to the College of Engineering, because the Center for Entrepreneurship is actually in the College of Engineering, and we have 19 different colleges within the University of Michigan, and so there's been a lot of epicenters that have been growing up with regard to entrepreneurship, so I thought it's important you understand where we come from. I'll talk about entrepreneurship and education, the how, the what, the why, and then finish up with what we're doing there. So I like to keep things pretty casual, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them as we go. I have no problem doing this. Honestly, I'm more used to leading a class than being in front of a video camera, so the more interaction we have, probably be more comfortable for me. So it would be really helpful to know who you are. So I'll ask a series of questions maybe, and you can just sort of either raise your hand, shout out, things like that. How many of you are students, current students? Great, and those of you from the community, I don't want to leave you out. Great. Those of you that are students, how many of you are in your first and second year? And those of you in your third and fourth year or beyond? Great. And how many of you are studying language arts? How many of you are studying engineering? How many of you are studying business? How many of you are studying math? How many of you can help me figure out what I'm missing? Go ahead, what? Great, love the sciences. How many of you are in the sciences? Great, and what else am I missing? Anything, or did I cover everybody? Great. Material sciences? And how many of you are taking this class because you have to? It's okay. It's always good to know. Great. Okay, so like I said, I'm in the College of Engineering. So about 7 years ago, our dean, Dean Munson, recognized the fact that the world was changing. We, at one time, were agricultural, then it became the industrial age, and then we became the age of innovation. And with the age of innovation, what we need to actually generate human capital has really changed. The other thing that we've noticed is that paths are changing. There was a generation where people stayed in one position for their entire career, right? So my father started at Griner Engineering when he walked out of his graduate school, and then he retired there over 30 years later. Whereas I've had about 7, 8 different jobs, and I switched jobs probably every 18 months to 3 years. I look a lot, I'm actually a lot older than I look, just in case you guys are wondering. So it's really interesting that as the paths are changing, we have to embrace the ability for you to be able to determine where you're going. And so what we saw that as we look at education for engineering students, that we really need to change how we're doing it. So there was this big initiative looking at what Engineer of 2020 looks like. And they look very different because for us to maintain a position in terms of the global economy, we needed to make sure that our engineering students stood out, because other countries are generating engineering students 2-3 times more quickly than we are. And so for us to maintain a forefront in terms of the global economy, we needed to make sure that our students differentiated themselves beyond the fact that they had a deep domain expertise. There's no question that you have to be extremely skilled at whatever you go to school for, whether or not it's biology, whether or not you go for business or engineering, you need that deep domain expertise. But that's not enough anymore. The technical skills are no longer enough, because what happens is there was a generation where you became a cog in whatever that industry organization was. But now you have the opportunity to orchestrate where you go, right? Careers are changing, people change every time, and with the economy the way in which it is, especially with the automotive industry, we've seen that layoffs happen, and so you need to make sure that you can embrace where it is that you're going to go and take control over what that is. And so our dean actually redefined what he felt a Michigan engineer should be, right? The Michigan engineer should be many things. He wanted to make sure that they were global. Everyone should have an international experience. That international experience could be a semester abroad, a week abroad, a summer abroad, but the point is you had to understand how things are determined in other cultures, how to communicate, and how to interact. He wanted to make sure that engineers knew how to design, right? There was a generation of engineers that used to go to school because they needed the theoretical knowledge beyond what they were doing at home. They were building in their garage, they were fixing their cars and things like that. So they were going to four-year education institutions in order to get that theoretical knowledge. But in fact, that's changed. With technology, there's an ability to become an engineer without even picking up a hammer. So he wanted to make sure that our students were actually designing still. And then the next was he wanted to make sure that our students had what we called an entrepreneurial mindset. And we'll talk about that in a second here. So what he saw was there really was a new role of an engineer, right? So in the pre-Cold War, we were really trying to support the establishment, solve the problems, and develop feature-rich processes. But in the post-Cold War, people were looking to engineers to identify the unmet need. They wanted to leverage the disruptive or high technology that our speakers were talking about and actually design for those unmet needs. And engineers were critical in defining that new market creation, right? And so we need to be able to be agile and change our educational process in order to meet those needs. Because the way we have been teaching engineering students, at least for over the past 50 years, has actually not changed dramatically until very recently. The same book that I used to learn Chemical Engineering 230 20 years ago is the same one that they're using today, right? So we needed to do things. The new engineer needed to be creative, needs to be able to speak to their business partners. You don't necessarily have to be the person doing business development, but you absolutely need to understand where the technology that you're creating impacts the future of that business. Because if you don't understand where that's going, then you're the first one on that layoff list. You have to add value to that company. You need to look at problems as new opportunities, and you need to be able to take the customer where they may not know that they need to go, right? That's how we're defining new markets. And so they need to be entrepreneurially minded, which is what our dean felt was very important. And what entrepreneurially minded means to many different people is many different things. And so our job in the higher education is to really start to define those things and think about how we can educate people in those processes. So the new engineering skills for entrepreneurial mindset are really around four things, right? They need to know those engineering fundamentals and technical depth. There needs to be customer awareness. There needs to be business acumen, and they have to understand societal values. They have to understand the impact of the technology that they're developing and how that impacts the society. So there's a lot of things that the engineering student needs to be thinking about when they're going through school. And so that's the drive of why entrepreneurship started in the engineering school at the college. We were the second center to open around entrepreneurship at University of Michigan, the first one being the Zell-Lurie Institute, which is in the business school, and we'll talk about that traditional approach to entrepreneurial education. So what we know is we want our students to be entrepreneurial, but what does that mean for higher education? So why do we go to school, right? Typically, you want to go to school for the skill sets, right? But the other reason you go to school is the hope is that you're going to accelerate your knowledge faster than you would get by just learning it on the streets, right? So you go to sit in these classes and you go to meet with different faculty because the hope is that they have a broader understanding of what's going on in the entire market or in the entire area in which you're studying and can actually distill down that information and help and translate that out to you, right? So that you're actually cutting out the time that it would take for you to learn that through the random walk. So how do faculty members and researchers who are developing these types of things transfer information to each other? They do it through writing papers and doing research and an exchange of ideas. So for GRINS, what I did was I actually went through and looked at the number of publications in entrepreneurship. And this is where I essentially got the definition for this talk when I talk about the rise of entrepreneurship. I went and looked in Scopus. For those of you who don't know what Scopus is, it's one of those library catalogs where you can put in a keyword and search for the number of publications that come out. And I saw that if you graph the number of papers that are actually talking about entrepreneurship from the early 1900s, you can see that there's been a significant exponential rise in the last 20 years or so. Interestingly, there's a dip in just the last year, and we can talk about what those things might be. But the point is, entrepreneurship has had a significant rise, showing that it's become very interesting to many different people. It's becoming a discipline where people can share and exchange ideas in terms of how you actually cultivate entrepreneurs and educate entrepreneurs. So we talked about in the previous panel is that entrepreneurship is prevalent all over, right? A lot of people think that entrepreneurship is the answer to the economy, it's the answer to higher education, it's an answer to the youth. But you have to really wonder, what does that mean, right? So we heard from 3 incredible panelists. They talked about incredible opportunities, and when I was thinking about it, they were talking about the entire spectrum of entrepreneurship, and there's a lot to learn. They talked about just the mindset of how to get out there and to do it, how you have to avoid being afraid of failure, and then they were talking about transactions, of what happens in that business when you're actually trying to execute. That's a lot to actually discern in 1 hour, and so the question is how do you actually teach entrepreneurship, how do you teach the different pieces, and what are those things? And so that is what our job has been, is to really look at what that is. And what I'll explain to you is how entrepreneurship education has significantly changed in probably the last 15 years. So this is the point where I sort of say, well, you know, before we get started, you sort of got to wonder how someone like me actually ends up standing in front of you, because I'm not the traditional faculty member that you're going to see at the university that just has been doing research for their entire life and so has running a research lab. So I wanted to sort of give you a glimpse of who I am and sort of understand why I am so, I resonate with the idea of what we call that mindset. So when I was in probably undergrad, I had basically made the decision that I was going to go to graduate school. And I was going to go to graduate school in the hearing sciences. And so I spent 4 years in my undergrad trying to get myself into grad school. Then I went to grad school and I was going to do everything I could to learn about the hearing sciences. And I ended up focusing on this very incredible yet small problem. At least when I said small, it was basically there were 7 people in the world that essentially cared about what I was researching. They were very enthusiastic, but there was only 7 of them. And so at that time I was wondering what it is that I wanted to do every day, because I just didn't have the passion waking up every day to say, what is the dorsal cochlear nucleus doing? It just wasn't something that was going to inspire me for the next 30 years. The other problem I had is we actually, you know, life got involved. I had a husband, he had places he had to go, he was in the Army, we had to make decisions, and so somebody had to give. And since the US government wasn't going to give, it was going to be me. So I went on to do a series of things, all very much attached to the fact that my husband was moving around. I worked for Southwest Research Institute. I basically went from a PhD program where I was only thinking about basic science, and I was thrust into working for a company. And let me tell you how not to negotiate that first job, because when I went into that first job, I was basically saying, oh my gosh, I have to live in Texas, I have no idea what I'm going to do, and I just happened to show up in this company that said that they would interview me. And they got to the point where they said, great, what kind of salary would you want? And I said, well, I don't know, I'm living great off of $6,000. Don't do that. But the point is that it gave me an opportunity to start thinking about different ideas. Essentially, I had to take the skill sets that I knew I had, right? But they had to be more than the skills that I had just been learning about the dorsal cochlear nucleus, because that will only sell so far, right? And I had to think about how I had learned to problem solve, how I'd learned to communicate, how to write, and sell myself to another organization to prove to them that I could add value outside of what they were typically thinking. And so hence started my entrepreneurial path. I started to think about how to sell myself, how to find a value proposition for me and organizations I was selling myself to. And that path just kept going. We ended up moving to Washington, D.C. I started working for DARPA. Again, very much randomly showed up in a place saying that they would interview me, and I had to figure out how I was going to sell the fact I was doing medical device development to a company that predominantly was thinking about defense, right? But luckily at that time, well, not so luckily, they were very concerned about biodefense, and so they ended up hiring me through that. Then we moved again, and when we went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, I started working for a startup company as well as a venture capitalist. And so every time I had to think of new value propositions, right? So the theme became you had to innovate yourself to be able to continue to move on based on the constraints that I had. And so how does someone go from that to entrepreneurship at the university? Always wanting to be in a university environment and to actually teach. I had the opportunity through several discussions with people at University of Michigan to get involved in what they have as a design program. How many of you guys know what a design program is? So if you're an engineering student, and you'll find that more and more different disciplines are asking for that. If you're an engineering student, you have to do something called a capstone design to get that real world experience, which you heard your panelists talk about internships and the value of that real world experience. That is going all the way in, permeating throughout higher education. That we need to give you all an opportunity to actually work on separate things that you can sell yourselves to organizations. And so what we do is we have a capstone design program where students actually work with industry and try and solve problems. And that gives you an opportunity to learn how to interact with a customer, how to interact with different stakeholders, how to be professional, and how to be able to translate to when you get that first job. And so I thought about what it is that I needed to know, having gone from a very basic science background to be able to work in industry. And they asked me to create an opportunity for graduate students because the world of graduate students has significantly changed. So for those of you that know sort of that academic path, typically when you go to graduate school, you just used to fall straight into going into academics, but that doesn't happen anymore, right? The number of academic positions have seriously declined, and hence what we have is students are being trained, but they have to have other opportunities. So what are the things that they needed to know? They needed to harness a sense of urgency. They had to be an adaptive learner. They had to identify new opportunities. I had to learn how to sell myself and how to network. Again, things that you heard from your panelists on how critical that was. And so what we did was we created a graduate innovative design class. It was a very simple concept, right? Essentially, we wanted to provide those biomedical engineering students with an opportunity to develop skills that are applicable to the professional environment, okay? They needed to be able to be technically conversant for their job interview. They needed to learn how to take a project from completion that is not a traditional problem set to adaptive learning. They needed to know how to network, and they needed a project suitable for submission to a national competition. Why did I think that was important? Is because once they see that there's a value to people outside of just the person next to you, the actual academic learning is like a hockey stick. So I don't know about you, but most students will usually complain when I sit down in the classroom and tell them to do a certain assignment. And usually you, the student, are sitting there, this assignment is not very engaging, I don't know why this is relevant to me, it's not important. And then you sort of do the exercise because you have to and you're doing it for a grade. What's interesting is if we start to give you projects that actually do engage you or you have an opportunity to pick them, you become much more engaged and your learning becomes adaptive and you're doing it not because I'm telling you to, because it's more interesting to you. And so the class was in two sets, right? So first we did idea incubation and then we did idea realization. We had faculty from the hospital or local hospitals come in and say, these are the problems that I'm trying to solve on a daily basis. These are the challenges with the current solutions that I have, and this is what I need. And the students would sit there and come up with different ideas in terms of how to solve it. And then throughout the year, what they would do is create a prototype, they would develop a commercialization plan, and they would try and see what kinds of legs that they had on it. And so we had primary objectives. They had to understand the innovation value chain, and they needed to have the students necessary to be adaptive, okay? So the class basically adapted to each of the student groups that were in there. And so just to give you an example of some of the teams, we had several different ideas. We had teams that said, okay, we had a doctor that's a neurologist come in and say we have really challenges in terms of diagnosing people with Parkinson's, because it turns out with Parkinson's, you actually are, the way you're diagnosed based on symptoms. So if you have 5 out of 7 different symptoms, then people say you have Parkinson's. And so how do you do that? Well, you have the different clinicians are looking at you and saying, well, yes, I think you have that, I think you have that. But they don't quantify it. So the students created a device that could actually quantify some of the things that clinicians were seeing so that they could try and find a better way to diagnose Parkinson's and be consistent across clinicians. We had a group of students that heard that when you actually have an LVAD, which is a left ventricular device, put in you to be able to help you with your cardiac output and until you are able to have bypass, a lot of people have problems with that, not because of the problem of dealing with your heart, but actually there's an infection when you actually have the power cord coming out of your body that has the LVAD. So what is the infection from? That infection is from the fact that this power cord is actually oscillating in your skin and irritating the skin. So the students came up with a stabilization device that could actually hold that power cord stable on the output from the body. We had another group of students working with an arthroscopic surgeon who said, I have a really problem in trying to actually attach the ACL to the different knees when you're trying to do a replacement. And so they came up with a new way to actually secure the ACL into the knee. And then we had another group that was looking at different types of in vitro heart stimulation, so I don't want to get too far behind. And then we also had a group of students that were actually looking at Botox. And this group is actually interesting because it was a cosmetic surgeon that actually came in and said, look, a lot of people love to get Botox treatment, right? Because they want to look young, they want to look beautiful. And then what he would say is the problem with Botox treatment is you actually have to use a needle to give them the Botox treatment. But shockingly, people are really afraid of needles. And so the students said, okay, well, what's the problem with that? Botox happens to be a large molecule. What if we have a different way that we can actually administer this type of Botox? And they came up with a transdermal patch in order to do that. And this group went on to actually patent their device, and one of the gentlemen working on that actually went on to be a CTO of a company that's actually working on transdermal patch delivery. So what are tangible outcomes of what happened? So many of them learned how to write a business plan, several of them got provisional patents, and many of them got summer internships. In the first year, the students of 17 students raised $45,000 in funding by themselves. So I only raised $30,000, they got over 45. So, and so then there were the intangibles. What were those intangibles? You know what? They learned how to define a problem. They learned how to solve problems. They had leadership. They were committed, and boy, were these kids persistent. They were networking. They were reaching out to medical device companies on their own. They became extremely entrepreneurial, in fact. They were doing everything on their own with very little leadership or guidance from me. And so that was really intriguing to me. And so the question was, why? So was it the content? Was it the design process? Was it the fact that they just wrote a business plan? Or was it in the environment? Was it the fact that they teamed together? Was it that they were identifying the problems themselves because I wasn't giving it to them? Was it because they were working on real problems, or was it because they were doing it hands-on, they were doing the building themselves? So it turns out there's actually a little bit of everything of why that they were being so successful. And so I went back to look at entrepreneurship education, and it turns out over the first 40 years, this is how people usually do education in entrepreneurship. They sat in a room like you, and they would learn about business plans. So when you look at a business plan, it would be very much about, okay, you need to have a marketing plan, you need to have a finance. It was very much taken from what we know about big business, right? They said, okay, this is what I know about business running. We know that we have to have corporate financials, we need to have a 5-year projection, and people would say you have to write these business plans. The problem is these business plans are about 30 pages long. And people spend so much time writing these business plans that they actually are unwilling to realize that that should be a living document. because they would get so far and so committed to that business plan, once they started to execute and found out things didn't work, they wouldn't let go. And so a lot of things failed because of these problems. And so there was that problem, that the fact that people were so committed to sort of this process world. The other is that they were teaching people about entrepreneurs. They weren't teaching them about how to be entrepreneurially minded, right? They would say, this is what an entrepreneur is, and this is what you would do if you were an entrepreneur, and this is how you would write things. And things were very linear, and there were so many more opportunities. And so the challenges were that entrepreneurship education really lived in business schools. And it wasn't really recognized as a discipline to date, right? So about 15 years ago, that curve that I showed you at the beginning was not at that peak. And so it was really hard to say that this was a discipline within the business schools. And so it was predominantly taught by practitioners, who are phenomenal. But the interesting thing is that all of that great data and information that was going out was being very siloed, right? It was an amazing practitioner speaking to a group of students, but there was not as much cross-fertilization of that information to be shared. And so the value of that crowdsourcing of information was not being captured. And so in the last 15 years, that's really given us the ingredients for a perfect storm, right? Because people saw a challenge. You saw things such as, and we talked about it earlier, the Facebooks and the Amazons that were coming up that were actually coming from a technological side. They saw that people outside of the business community were creating great entrepreneurial opportunities, and people started to get an excitement beyond just those students that went to business schools. And with that enthusiasm and excitement from people in schools of music and science and things of that sort, you see a huge rise of people thinking about entrepreneurship and how to teach it. And so it's that perfect storm, right? The economy started to tank. You notice that there was this huge impedance mismatch of there were great ideas coming out of health sciences, the medical schools, engineering schools, and yet there wasn't this ability to pull all of this information into the commercial world because the number of people reaching into those places were declining, right? Education was saying, look, you actually need to learn by doing. And there was a huge push for multidisciplines, right? That there's so much that can be learned by bringing all of these things together. And so that's what's helped us really create new opportunities for entrepreneurship. And so it's not all about just venture creation anymore, right? We understand that actually there's a much bigger part to entrepreneurship that we haven't explored, and that is the importance of search, right? So the business schools have done a great job at thinking about the execution phase, right? We know how to teach finance well, we know how to teach accounting well, but you even heard from one of your panelists that some of the things that he met immediately outside of graduating from business school still wasn't taught in business schools. But that execution phase, they've done a good job of sort of trying to teach how to company build. But there's this whole front end thing called search. Why do most startups fail? Most startups fail because they haven't identified a customer. They haven't proven that a customer actually exists. And so what we've done is we've started to expand this idea of entrepreneurship to say, you know what, if you stop and think about the customer first and iterate that and get in front of customers and do that customer search, you will be even more successful. So there's been this huge wave within entrepreneurship education to remind people that you have to actually get out there and talk to people. And what we really push is the idea of founders have to talk to potential customers. It's not enough for you to go and actually hire someone to do your marketing or someone to do your sales when you're actually starting that first company. You need to get out there and actually speak to potential customers to know not only is it a good idea, but that someone will exchange money for that idea. And the only way that you're going to know that is by actually standing in front of a customer. Because a lot of times people will say, no, I know everyone wants this. And then they'll go and create something, but only to find that only one individual does. And what's really interesting to see is when the students first go out and they say, no, people thought that was a bad idea, so those people are stupid. What they realize, when you hit number 50 and that person's still telling you it's a bad idea, then you need to be listening. And so that increases your ability to actually become more successful. And so what we're trying to do with entrepreneurial education is not only teach people the fundamental skills of that building, but also think about entrepreneurship in terms of risk. Entrepreneurs often are known for, they're risk takers. But it's not enough to be a risk taker. And if you actually look at entrepreneurs, they're not just risk takers, they're making calculated risks. So how do you make calculated risk? You actually think about what you're doing, right? And so what we're trying to do is teach those students to make those calculated risks. And so we have the evolution of what we call the third approach to entrepreneurship education, and that is the cognitive world, making you think entrepreneurially, think and do. How do you identify that opportunity and learn about the venture process as well as the decision-making process? And so with any new field, you're going to have new challenges, right? So what are some of those challenges? One of which is, are we speaking the same language, right? If you look at engineers who do design, we talk about things in terms of stakeholders and customers. When you talk about with people in business, they talk more about customers. You have to make sure that we have the same type of vocabulary so that you're not having a mismatch through that. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we have shared vocabulary with all the students. We also want to avoid what we call survey courses, which is sort of the hit and run, right? There's been several courses where you give people a glimpse of, this is a little bit about the market, this is a little bit about finances, but you don't have an opportunity to go deep. And so we've really tried to create opportunities for people to think beyond sort of just that glimmer of what it might be, because if you actually wanted to put it into action, you need to be able to defend it at another level. We also want to harness learnings from all disciplines, right? There's a huge push to have much more conversation around multidisciplinary things. We want to think creatively, we want to think about design thinking, we want to bring in that marketing. How do you identify whether or not that market exists? How do you talk to that customer? What exactly is innovation? All of those pieces come together, and that's why, even though this is challenging, there's always opportunities where there's challenges, and that's why University of Michigan has really taken this on, because very few places have the diverse number of disciplines on one place. So it's been an incredible opportunity. So if you think about entrepreneurship in terms of continuum, the system integrator that brings innovations forward, it goes much beyond where we were before, where before it was much more about executing plans. Now we go all the way from inspiration to search and executing plans, and we've been working on that continuum at the university. So if I like this definition of entrepreneurship, it's rather long, but if you want to concentrate on what it is that's underlined, is entrepreneurship is a dynamic process of vision, change, and creation. All of those things are really critical. It's a willingness to take risks, but it's important to understand that that's calculated risk. You want to know how to bring together an effective team, how to marshal important resources, and also be able to build that incredibly solid business plan and the vision to be able to recognize an opportunity. All things that you heard from your panelists. And what's interesting is I certainly didn't prime them. These are things that they got from being out there every day and working hard for those things. And so it requires both skills and intuition. And the thing is, what we're trying to do is help you formulate how to generate that intuition. Some people are like, oh, well, I just don't think that way. In fact, you actually can be taught to think intuitively. Okay, so how do we teach those? We teach it through core skills, and the intuition, we do it through engaged learning, making sure that you are learning by doing and trying to do it on campus. So there's no better place than U of M to develop these things, and so we have sort of what we call the perfect storm for entrepreneurship education. Where we were 10, 15 years ago, things were very much around academic exercises. We were teaching about the design process. You were teaching them about commercialization. It was much more passive, sitting in a lecture hall, someone speaking at you, and skills were delivered to you, and you sort of assumed that infrastructure actually existed for you to flow into. You would go to school, from school you would go on to the line, from the line you would move up to the management role, et cetera. So where we are, we're all about engaged learning. From the minute you hit the door at University of Michigan, we expect you to actually start to do things. Very much about design thinking that you can apply to what you do in your classes, whether or not you're an engineer or something else. All of that design thinking is important. Understanding the problem you're trying to solve, what the value is of that, and how you can solve that. We're thinking about not only commercialization, but entrepreneurship. How do you take it from an idea and actually put it in the hands of someone for use, whether or not that's a customer or a company or an individual? Skills plus, right? There's soft skills that you heard from your panelists talking about. You need to know how to speak to people, right? That communication skill is critical, and oddly, we actually don't teach it in any, in many of your classes, you're not really taught how to communicate well. You want to seek and create a path, and what we're trying to do is really help create the future human capital.